I wasn't supposed to be sitting at table 4. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was the kind of event where the champagne glasses never dipped below half full and the lighting made everyone look slightly more powerful than they actually were. The room smelled like gardenias and money, and the tension underneath it was real. My husband stood near the center. Investors leaned toward him the way people lean toward someone whose opinion shapes things. I had been beside him all evening. Then I stepped toward the bar. That's when I saw them. Ethan was near the back. 3 years had passed. He looked the same. Still handsome in the way that photographs well and means very little. Still carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never truly been held accountable for anything. And Hannah, my stepsister, was moving through the crowd in a red dress, smiling at people she barely knew, tilting her head the way she did when she needed someone to find her charming. She was moving directly toward my husband. I took a slow sip of my champagne, because here's what Hannah didn't know that night. She thought she was walking toward a stranger. A powerful man she could work. A situation she could rearrange the way she had rearranged every situation for 30 years. She had no idea she was walking toward the man who signed her husband's paychecks. And by the time that night ended, Hannah was going to lose everything she had spent years building on top of what was mine. But to understand why that gala mattered, you need to go back. All the way back. To a split-level house in Concord, North Carolina, where I spent most of my childhood learning that some children are chosen. And some children are just useful. I was the useful one. My father Martin married Linda when I was 7 years old. I want to be fair about this, because fairness is something I've had to deliberately choose. Martin was not a cruel man. He didn't shout. He didn't neglect. He was a decent man who loved his daughters, both of us, in whatever limited way he was capable of. But there is a difference between loving someone and choosing them. Martin loved me. He chose Hannah. Linda had Hannah from her first marriage. Hannah was 8 when our parents got together. Dark hair, large eyes, and the specific confidence that only comes from being told repeatedly that you are exceptional. Her biological father wasn't in the picture. So Martin became her father. And Hannah, almost immediately, became his favorite. My 10th birthday is the example I always come back to. A humid Saturday in June. I opened gifts at the dining room table. When I got to the craft store gift card and mentioned wanting watercolor supplies, Hannah said, "Oh, I've been doing watercolors. Let me show everyone what I've been working on." And that was it. The conversation shifted to Hannah's paintings. Linda pulled out her phone. Martin leaned over to look. They spent the next 15 minutes discussing Hannah's artistic talent while my birthday cake sat on the counter with its candles burning down. I remember staring at those flames and thinking, this is normal. This is just how it is. The shift. When Hannah stopped being thoughtlessly selfish and became deliberately so, I can pinpoint to one event. Junior year of high school, I was named section editor for the school newspaper. Small achievement, but it mattered to me. I told Martin and Linda at breakfast. Martin looked up from his coffee. "Oh, nice." Hannah was half listening on her phone. She said, "I could probably do that. I'm a good writer." 3 weeks later, she joined the newspaper. 6 weeks after that, she had her own column. She didn't want to write. She wasn't passionate about journalism. She did it because I had something and she needed to have it too. That was the year I understood. Hannah didn't just want attention. She wanted whatever I had. There's a version of this story where Hannah is a cartoon villain, cold-eyed and calculated from birth. That's not accurate. The truth is more uncomfortable. She was a child handed a template by the adults around her. Every time she pulled focus, she was rewarded. Every time she absorbed what was mine and made it hers, the people who should have redirected her smiled instead. She learned what worked. By adulthood, it was as natural to her as breathing. There is one more thing from this period I need to tell you. It seemed small at the time. I only understood what it meant years later. My grandfather, Robert Beaumont, my mother's father, used to watch me with a very specific expression. Like he was calculating something, protecting something. He was meticulous about money. Private in the way people are when they don't trust others to manage what they've built. Birthday cards with handwritten notes that cited real things I'd actually done or said. A $20 bill tucked into a book he thought I'd like. The particular way he asked about school and remembered the answer the next time he saw me. He saw me in a way the rest of my family rarely did. When I was 19, he passed away. Dad said he handled everything from the estate. I believed him. That was a mistake I would spend years paying for. 4 years after the newspaper incident, I got engaged. And for one brief moment I thought I had something Hannah couldn't take. I was wrong. I met Ethan through a mutual friend at a work happy hour in the fall of 2016. Tall, funny in a group setting, the kind of man who remembered everyone's drink orders and made you feel seen in a crowd. We dated for 2 years. The proposal was private. His grandmother's ring, a small oval sapphire with 2 tiny diamonds on either side. A Tuesday night in his kitchen after dinner. He said he'd done it on a Tuesday intentionally because he knew I'd hate a spectacle. He was right. That he knew that about me mattered more than the ring itself. October 2018. I was 28 years old. Martin cried when I told him. Actual tears. I hadn't seen that from him since his mother's funeral. Hannah hugged me, held on a second too long, and said, "He's wonderful, Claire. You're so lucky." Not, "I'm so happy for you." Not, "This is wonderful." Lucky. As if good things happened to me by accident. As if I had stumbled into this, not because of anything I'd chosen, but because chance had briefly decided to cooperate. I let it go. We set a date for June 2020. $12,000 deposit on a venue outside Waxhaw. Booked a caterer, paid half up front. $4,200. Chose flowers, a band, a photographer. Hannah was my maid of honor. I asked her because I genuinely believed we had grown past the childhood dynamics. People tell themselves what they need to believe. Now something happened around this time that I didn't connect to anything until much later. I called my Uncle James, my mother's brother, to share the engagement news. He was warm, congratulatory. And then, right before we hung up, he said something that didn't quite land right. "Has your father talked to you about your grandfather's estate? All the paperwork?" I said yes, Dad handled everything when Grandpa passed. James went quiet. Just for a moment. Then, right. Of course. Good. I didn't know why that pause felt strange. I filed it away. The texting between Hannah and Ethan started, as far as I can tell, in December 2018. I noticed it at Christmas dinner. Hannah on her phone more than usual, angling the screen away when I passed. Ethan laughing too easily at something she said. A shared look that ended a half-second late. I filed it away. January. Her name on his phone twice in one evening while he showered. I didn't look at the messages. I told myself I trusted him. February. A dinner where Ethan and Hannah spent 30 minutes discussing a show they'd been watching for weeks. Texting about it the whole time. "We just have a lot of the same taste," Hannah said, smiling at me with full brightness. I sat across the table from my fiancé and my stepsister, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Not collapse. Just give. The way old floorboards do when the joists underneath are quietly rotting. I told myself I was imagining it. I found out on a Thursday night in March 2019. At 11:43 p.m. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch. His phone buzzed on the cushion next to him. I walked over to turn the lamp off. The screen lit up as I passed. The preview was visible without unlocking. It was from Hannah. I'm not going to reproduce the exact words here. What I will tell you is that it was not ambiguous. It was not friendly. It was the kind of message that, once you see it, you cannot unknow. I stood in the living room in my socks. The television was still on. A cooking show muted. The blue light moved across Ethan's sleeping face and I watched him breathe and I thought, I am looking at a stranger. I have been living with a stranger. I picked up his phone. I had his passcode, his mother's birthday. I read everything. 2 months of messages. Deliberate. Ongoing. 63 days. He hadn't stumbled into something. Neither had she. This was a choice they had both made and remade, over and over again. I put the phone back. I went to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and I did not cry. Not yet. I was so far past the point of tears I couldn't access them. Every cell in my body had gone completely still. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just losing a fiancé. I was about to lose my entire family. I confronted him in the morning. I waited until we were both fully awake. I put his phone on the kitchen table between us and said, "Tell me what this is." He looked at the phone. He looked at me. And then he said, "Claire, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to get this far. Didn't mean for it to get this far." As if 63 days of deliberate choice was a navigation error. I told him to call Hannah and tell her what was happening, or I would. He called. She cried. I could hear the performance of it from across the room. That afternoon I drove to my parents' house. 45 minutes through gray March cold. Martin met me at the door. Linda hovered in the kitchen doorway. I explained as calmly as I could. The affair. The messages. The 63 days. I told them the engagement was over. There was a silence long enough to hear the refrigerator hum. And then my father said, "Claire, honey, people make mistakes." I waited. "This doesn't have to be the end of everything," he continued. "Ethan is a good man. Hannah, she's young. She makes bad decisions sometimes. But that's not a reason to blow up 2 relationships. Don't blow up 2 relationships," I said. "Martin, they had an affair for 2 months. We have $12,000 in venue deposits. Money can be worked out," he said. I looked at my father. Really looked at him. "They had an affair," I said. "While I was planning my wedding. While Hannah was supposed to be helping me plan my wedding. And you're asking me not to make this difficult." He looked at the floor. Then he said the 5 words that told me exactly where I ranked in that house. "Hannah is very upset." Not, "I'm sorry, Claire." Not, "You deserve better than this." Not, "How are you holding up?" Hannah is very upset. My stepsister had just been caught in a 2-month affair with my fiancé. And my father's first concern, the first thing he reached for, was her feelings. I drove home. Canceled the venue. Lost the deposit. Called the caterer. Got half back, about $2,000. The photographer kept his fee. Total out of pocket, $14,000. And an engagement ring I left on the kitchen counter and never saw again. I also had 63 save-the-date cards I'd been about to mail. They sat in a box on my dining table for 2 weeks. A return address for a future that had stopped being real. Every time I walked past that box, I felt something that didn't have a name. Not grief, not anger, just the cold weight of a life that had been real and then wasn't. The gaslighting started almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, the family narrative had quietly restructured. Hannah was struggling with her feelings. She'd apparently always had feelings for Ethan, and it was simply difficult to suppress them. I was being rigid. I was being unforgiving. My father didn't say these things to me directly. He said them to his sister, who said them to her daughter, who said them to a mutual friend of mine, who called to gently ask if I was doing okay. And Hannah, consequence-free golden Hannah, began posting. Not about the affair. Of course not. She posted about growth. about listening to your heart, about not apologizing for wanting what you want. Her comments were full of people saying, "You're so brave. I admire your honesty." She had rearranged reality so thoroughly that her followers didn't know they were watching a woman celebrate stealing her stepsister's fiancé. I sat in my apartment that winter and watched my family funnel toward her. The way water moves toward whatever is lowest. I thought, I am not going to survive this. I was wrong about that. I started therapy in April 2019. 3 weeks after the confrontation, my therapist said something months in that I've never forgotten. "You've spent a long time organizing your life around the task of not being too much trouble. What would it look like to stop doing that?" I didn't have an answer immediately, but I started looking for one. I moved into a better apartment, took on more responsibility at work. Marketing strategy for a commercial real estate development firm. Promotion in October 2019. Limited contact with family. Birthday texts. Occasional calls with Martin where we discussed nothing that mattered. Hannah and Ethan got together officially in July 2019. Posted about it. Rooftop bar, Hannah laughing, Ethan looking at her the way he used to look at me. 17 people who knew us both left congratulations in the comments. I put my phone face down on the bed. Stared at the ceiling for 10 minutes. Then got up and went for a run. That was the worst day. After that one, the rest were survivable. I met Andy at a commercial real estate conference in Raleigh in February 2020. He was one of the keynote speakers. The CEO of a firm called Aldermore Group, based in Charlotte. He talked about long-term thinking in volatile markets with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. I stayed until he finished. Found myself at the coffee station in the same hallway afterward. He asked what I thought of the session. I told him honestly, including one significant point of disagreement. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Say more." That was the beginning. Now I need to tell you something. Something I knew early. Something I held carefully and did not share with my family for months. 3 months into knowing Andy, right around the time our professional connection was becoming something more, I learned something that changed the shape of everything. Aldermore Group employed roughly 200 people across the Carolinas. Project managers, operations staff, coordinators. One of those employees was Ethan. He had taken a position at Aldermore in early 2021. Same role as always, project manager, mid-level, comfortable. The kind of position where you feel important to the people around you while staying invisible to anyone above you. He had apparently never mentioned to Hannah, or if he had, she hadn't processed it, that his company's CEO was named Andy. I sat with that information. I turned it over. I examined it from every direction, looking for something manipulative in myself. Some version of this that was about revenge rather than something real. What I found was, I was in love with a man who made me feel heard in a way I had never experienced before. Andy was not performing the role of impressive man. He already was one and had the self-possession to be entirely unbothered by it. He remembered things I said in passing and acted on them quietly without announcement. He said once when I told him a difficult story about my family, "That sounds genuinely exhausting," and meant it. He ordered dinner to my apartment on a hard week without making a production out of it. The differences between him and Ethan were not dramatic. They were granular. And that made them more significant. When Martin eventually heard I was seeing someone, through the family network because I hadn't volunteered anything, he called me on a Sunday in August 2021. His voice was tight. "Claire," he said. "This man you're seeing. His last name, is it Aldermore?" "Yes," I said. A silence. And then, "You need to understand what this looks like." "What it looks like to who?" "To Ethan. To Hannah. To..." He stopped. "It looks like you're making a point." I met Andy 14 months before Ethan even worked for him, I said. I don't arrange my life around Ethan's org chart. Claire. No. I'm not leaving someone I care about because his proximity makes Ethan uncomfortable. That is not a conversation I am willing to have. A long pause. And then my father said it again. The same 5 words. The same reflex. Hannah is very upset. Let that sit for just a moment. My stepsister, who spent 2 months texting my fiancé while helping me address wedding invitations, was upset about my relationship with a man I had met and fallen in love with entirely on my own terms. And my father's response was to call me and deliver her feelings like a summons. As if my happiness was required to pause whenever Hannah's comfort was at risk. I'm sure she is, I said. I have to go. I hung up. The calls didn't stop. Martin called twice more. Linda once. And then Ethan called. Twice. The second call was late. His voice was low and too deliberate, in the way of a man who'd had a couple of drinks. I'm not asking you not to see him, he said, which was almost certainly a lie. It's weird. You have to admit it's weird. Ethan, I said, you are currently engaged to my stepsister. I have 0 remaining space for your discomfort. I hung up. Hannah noticed those calls. Of course she did. She had his phone habits memorized the way I once had, the same skills transferred to a new subject. She noticed that he went quiet after talking to me, that he became distracted, that he started looking up Aldermore Group press coverage more than usual. He had started caring again what I thought of him. Maybe he'd never stopped. Hannah saw it. And Hannah, being Hannah, decided the problem wasn't Ethan's lingering feelings. The problem was Andy. If she could neutralize Andy, charm him, redirect him, make herself interesting enough to disrupt whatever was developing, she could neutralize everything else. She had solved problems this way her entire life. Made people fall in love with her. Or at least interested. Or at least charmed enough to become useful. It had worked every time. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Andy knew everything. I had told him about the affair, about the family dynamics, about Hannah's patterns, how she identified what mattered to other people, how she moved toward it, how she expected it to simply become hers. He had listened carefully, without judgment, without performative outrage. He was not worried. This, in retrospect, was the correct response. In September 2021, Hannah came to Aldermore's downtown Charlotte office, ostensibly to drop something off for Ethan, which on its surface was plausible. The office manager let her in. She spent 7 minutes at Ethan's desk. She then spent 40 minutes in the building's shared common area near the glass-walled executive lounge. She positioned herself where Andy would pass. She introduced herself. Warm. She had researched the firm's recent projects beforehand. She tilted her head and smiled and listened in all the right ways. Andy was polite. Professional. He shook her hand. Said something brief about the project she mentioned. And then he walked away. She stood there for a moment. In the open common area, glass walls on both sides, several staff members visible through them. She had not anticipated needing an exit strategy. Every version of this conversation she'd rehearsed in her head had ended with him interested, redirected, at least curious. None of those versions included him simply leaving mid-sentence. An administrative assistant at a nearby desk looked up briefly, then back down at her screen. A project coordinator coming in from the hallway slowed just enough to register the scene. A woman standing alone near the executive lounge, smile still in place, no one facing her, before moving on. Hannah walked back through the lobby. She had arrived with confidence. She left with posture. He told me that evening over dinner, in the same tone he'd used to describe something moderately interesting that had happened in a meeting. Your stepsister came by today, he said. I put down my fork. She seemed to be under the impression that a conversation would lead somewhere, he said. It didn't. He reached across the table briefly. I want you to know because I won't keep things from you. But I'm not particularly concerned. She struck me as someone who's accustomed to a specific kind of response, and was very confused not to receive it. I looked at him across the candlelight and thought, she has spent 30 years walking into rooms and shifting them. And he had simply walked away. What she had not calculated, she had been seen. Multiple people witnessed the exchange. One of them knew Ethan. Word moved the way it does in offices, sideways, quickly, quietly. By the next morning, Ethan knew his wife had spent 40 minutes in his company's building trying to charm his CEO. He called her from the office parking garage. I don't know exactly what was said. What I do know is that it was loud enough that 2 colleagues mentioned it afterward. Their marriage, 8 months old, rushed into by the momentum of everything that had come before it, had been straining since summer. Andy's connection to me was its own persistent wound. Hannah's office visit was not a bomb. But that wasn't the most important thing building at Aldermore that fall. Questions had been circling about a project Ethan had managed the previous spring. Timeline overruns. A subcontractor dispute handled carelessly. Documentation inconsistencies that individually were explainable, but together formed a picture that no one could reasonably ignore. A formal review was opened in October 2021. Ethan had been so focused on me, on what I was doing, who I was with, what it meant, that he had completely missed the slow accumulation of his own consequences. Some people spend so much energy watching the wrong thing that they never see what's actually coming. I need to pause the main story here. Because something happened in November 2021 that, even after everything I had already been through, I was not prepared for. My Uncle James called on a Tuesday afternoon. His voice had the careful weight of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say. There are some things about your grandfather's estate I think you should know, he said. You remember that pause years earlier when I told James that Dad had handled everything after Grandpa passed. That brief quiet I had filed away without fully understanding why. This is why. My grandfather had not simply left a will. He had established a trust. In 2005, 4 years before he died. He had designated me as a direct beneficiary of a specific portion of his estate, deliberately structured to be independent of my father's management. He had his own quiet concerns about how money moved through that family. He had built in a layer of protection. The trust was supposed to transfer to me when I turned 25. I turned 25 in 2015. The trust had never been transferred. James had believed for years that Martin had told me, had walked me through everything, made sure I knew what was mine. Martin had allowed him to believe this. How much? I asked. James told me the number. I sat down on my kitchen floor. The linoleum was cold through my jeans. I sat there with the phone in my hand and the sound of traffic outside and this strange suspended feeling. The feeling of finding out that something you always sensed was true actually, provably, was. Because I had always known my grandfather saw me. The birthday cards with handwritten notes that referenced specific things I'd actually said or done. The $20 bill tucked into a book he thought I'd like. The way he asked about school and remembered the answer. He saw me in a way the rest of my family rarely did. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a place I had never let myself fully reach, I had always wondered whether he tried to protect that. He had. He had left me $186,000. And it had been sitting in a trust account for 6 years, waiting for someone to tell me it existed. My grandfather had seen me clearly enough to try to protect me. Had built a structure around something, made sure it was legally mine. And my father had not stolen it, not in the dramatic way you imagine when you hear that word, but quietly, repeatedly decided that what was Claire's could wait. Could be managed. could be reorganized around whoever's needs were more present in the room. The same pattern, a different form. I hired an estate attorney named Patricia Dumas. Wore reading glasses on a chain, entirely unsentimental, competent in a way that made me trust her within the first 10 minutes. She confirmed James's account in 2 weeks. The documentation my grandfather had left was thorough. He had been meticulous. The trust instrument, the beneficiary designation, correspondence with his attorney, records showing the account had been maintained and earning interest since the year he established it. Every piece of paper said the same thing in different ways. This was mine. He had made that as clear as the law would allow. There was no ambiguity about intent. None at all. Patricia requested a formal response from Martin's legal representative within 30 days. He called me before his attorney could respond. It was a Thursday evening. I was still in my work clothes, standing in my kitchen when his name appeared on my phone. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't. "Claire," he said. "I'd like to talk to you before this becomes a legal matter." "It already is a legal matter," I said. "You can talk to me now, or I'll direct everything through Patricia's office." He talked. For several minutes he worked through prepared justifications in the familiar sequence. He had always meant to transfer it. The timing never felt right. There was a period when he and my mother were still sorting out disagreements from the divorce. As if that had anything to do with a trust my grandfather had established specifically to protect me from exactly this kind of situation. He hadn't wanted to disrupt my life. He thought I was managing fine. I let him finish. "How long did you know it existed?" I asked. "Claire, I'm asking a direct question. How long did you know about this trust and choose not to tell me?" A long silence. And then, a few years. 6 years had passed since I turned 25. During those 6 years I had gone through an engagement, a betrayal, a cancelled wedding, $14,000 in lost deposits, months of gaslighting, years of therapy, and an entire reconstruction of who I was. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up, quietly, on my own, with no financial cushion and no family safety net, because I had believed there was nothing there. There had been something there. There had always been something there. My grandfather had seen clearly enough to put it in writing. And my father had quietly decided to pretend the writing didn't exist. "I needed that money," I said. My voice was even. I had been in enough therapy to know the difference between speaking calmly and feeling calm. I was only one of those things. Not for anything dramatic. I needed it the way any adult needs resources. For options. For security. For the basic knowledge that someone in my family had thought I was worth protecting. He said nothing. "You took that from me. Not violently. Not with any single decision you can point to. But 6 years of choosing not to tell me, that's not an oversight, Martin. That's a choice. Made over and over again." "I know," he said. Quietly. Without the usual architecture of justification underneath it. That was the first time, in my entire adult life, that Martin had said those words to me without immediately following them with a but. I didn't soften it. I didn't reassure him. I told him Patricia would be in touch and I ended the call. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. Not crying. I had moved past the kind of grief that requires tears. It was something more structural than that. A rearrangement of everything I had believed about the past 12 years. I had always assumed that the difficulty of my adult life, the financial tightness, the sense of navigating without a net, was simply the circumstance of someone who hadn't been handed things. That I had built what I had because I had worked for it. That the absence of support was just a fact of my particular story. It had not been a fact. It had been a choice someone else made. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was scheduled for January 2022. Aldermore Group was a primary sponsor. Andy and I, we had married quietly in October 2021. A city hall ceremony with 4 friends and dinner at a restaurant we loved, simple and private, would both be attending. The guest list passed through Aldermore's administrative system. It included employees of the firm, which meant Ethan and Hannah would also be there. I noticed this. I said nothing. The gala was a Thursday in January. Cold enough that I almost regretted not wearing a coat. I wore dark navy. Simple. Structured. Andy and I arrived together. He moved through the room with the ease of someone who understood that real authority is quiet. Investors found him. Board members wanted his attention. I stayed beside him for the first hour and I noticed, as I always noticed, the way people arranged themselves around him without realizing they were doing it. Then I stepped toward the bar. That's when I saw Ethan near the back, scanning the room with that casual confidence, the ease of a man who had never truly been accountable. And then I saw Hannah. Red dress. Moving through the crowd with that deliberate visible awareness. The walk of someone who knows she's being watched and has decided to make it worth watching. She was greeting people she barely knew, tilting her head, working the room with the practiced warmth of a woman whose social position depended entirely on her husband's professional standing. She spotted Andy before she spotted me. I watched the decision form. The identification of what mattered. The movement toward it. I had seen it 100 times across 30 years. She was halfway across the room before she looked over far enough to see who was standing next to him. She stopped. For 3 full seconds she went completely still. I watched the exact moment she processed it. The smile didn't disappear. It never disappeared with Hannah, not fully, but it shifted. Reorganized itself into something more controlled. The face of someone who walked into a room expecting one thing and found something that didn't fit into any category she had prepared for. He came to us anyway. Claire, she said. I didn't know you'd be here. Hannah. Kept my voice even. Warm enough to be civil. Not 1 degree warmer. She looked at Andy. Extended her hand. We've actually met. Briefly. At your office. I remember, Andy said. He shook her hand. Said nothing further. Turned to someone approaching his other side and moved into conversation without so much as a shift in posture. No pause. No curiosity. No warmth beyond the minimum that courtesy required. Nothing. Hannah stood there. And I watched something happen to her face that I don't think she was aware of. A small, involuntary recalibration, like a compass needle swinging and failing to find north. She was a woman who had always known precisely what effect she was having on a room. She was not having any effect on this room. 2 of Ethan's colleagues were watching from across the space. They weren't being subtle about it. One of them said something to the other. I caught enough of the expression to understand. They had heard about the September office visit. They had been watching for this moment. This was not private anymore. The story of the September visit had moved through Aldermore the way stories move through offices. Selectively, efficiently, and always landing with the people who would find it most interesting. By the gala, at least 4 of Ethan's colleagues knew. Not through rumor exactly, through the specific certain knowledge of people who had been in the building that day and remembered the woman who had stood alone near the executive lounge waiting for an acknowledgement that didn't come. Hannah had walked into that office wanting to be seen as a threat. She had been seen as a curiosity. And now she was in the same room as every person who knew it. Hannah tried to recover. She turned back to me, the only available audience, and said something about the venue, how beautiful the room was. Her voice had a brightness pitched slightly too high. The performance of someone buying time while figuring out which exit to take. I agreed the room was beautiful. I offered nothing else. A board member's wife, someone I had met through Andy, passed behind Hannah at that moment and greeted me by name. We exchanged a few words. She smiled at Hannah with the polite blankness people reserve for someone they don't recognize and aren't interested in placing. Hannah, who had spent the last 20 minutes navigating this room as Ethan's wife and a person who mattered within it, had just been treated like a stranger by someone who knew me. I could see the calculation behind her eyes. The room she had entered with a plan was no longer the room she was standing in. The people in it had arranged themselves around a different set of facts than the ones she'd arrived with. She had no moves left that weren't visible. One of Ethan's senior colleagues, a man who had been with Aldermore for several years and who had been in the building the day of the September visit, watched her from across the room as she stood there. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The particular quality of his attention said everything. This was confirmation of something he had already known. Hannah looked at me once more. Her expression was something I've tried to name 100 times and can't. Not defeat exactly, not rage exactly, but the face of someone standing in a version of events they cannot rewrite. Then she turned and walked back toward where Ethan was standing. I watched him watch her cross the room. I watched him read her face. And I saw the moment he understood, in the way people understand things they'd rather not, that something had not gone the way she'd planned. The inch of distance between them when she reached his side. The way he looked at the room rather than at her. The specific, familiar stillness of two people who have run out of things they're willing to say in public. I had seen that stillness before. I had lived inside it. Ethan found me near the bar an hour later. His jaw was carrying tension he'd probably been holding since he walked in. "Claire," he said. "Ethan." He looked like a man who wanted to say something significant and couldn't locate the words. "You look good," he finally managed. "Thank you. He stopped. "I wanted to say I know things went badly. And I'm sorry. I've thought about it." I looked at him. The man who had worn his grandmother's ring when he proposed to me. The man I had loved and believed and planned a life with. The man who, for 63 days, had made a different choice. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. Honestly. Not warmly, but honestly. It was something. Not enough, but something. He nodded. Started to leave. Then stopped. Said quietly to no one in particular, "How did things get here?" "You made choices," I said. "They had consequences." He left. 20 minutes later, Aldermore's head of HR appeared at Andy's elbow at the edge of the room. A quiet exchange. Several minutes. I was close enough to observe, not close enough to hear. I didn't need to hear it. The formal review of Ethan's project conduct had concluded the previous week. The findings had been presented to senior leadership. A decision had already been made. Andy had been deliberately removed from the final recommendation process to avoid any appearance of personal conflict, and HR had been directed to process the outcome. Ethan was terminated the following Monday morning. I did not cause this. I want to say that as clearly as I know how. I had no involvement in the review. No influence over its outcome. No communication with anyone at Aldermore about Ethan's employment. The project issues predated my relationship with Andy by months. The documentation existed entirely independent of anything I knew or said. The review happened because his work warranted it. The termination happened because his work warranted it. The material was always there. He had spent months so consumed with watching me, what I was doing, who I was with, what it meant for him, that he completely missed the slow accumulation of his own professional consequences. Some people spend so much energy watching the wrong story that they walk straight into the consequences of the one they stopped paying attention to. The news reached Hannah before Ethan got home that Monday. That's how I heard it, through a family contact who knew someone at the firm. He had been called in that morning, handed a formal letter, and walked out within the hour. His keycard deactivated while he was still in the building. By the time he came through their apartment door, Hannah already knew. And she was not sympathetic. She was furious. Not at the outcome. At him. For the project failures that had made him vulnerable. For the months of distraction while his own consequences quietly accumulated. For making the same choices at work he had made everywhere else, with the comfortable assumption that no one was paying close enough attention. She had built her new life on the foundation of his income and his professional standing. That was the architecture of everything: the apartment, the social circle, the position she held in rooms full of Aldermore employees and their partners. Without his job, none of it held. The arguments that followed, "I only know pieces of this and I want to be accurate," were not just about the termination. They were about everything the termination cracked open. His calls to me after the gala. His distraction in the months before it. The way he'd gone quiet repeatedly, in ways Hannah had noticed and never been given a real explanation for. He had things to say. He had things to say back. "What I know is this. Two people who had rushed into a marriage built on momentum and shared betrayal, who had never examined what they actually were to each other outside of the damage they'd done together, suddenly had nothing to hide behind. The job was gone. The status was gone. The story they'd been telling themselves about what they'd built required a foundation that was no longer there. Some structures don't collapse dramatically. They just become impossible to maintain." Hannah posted that week. Vague and angry. About people who use proximity to power to destroy others. Several people who knew the situation understood immediately. Her comment section filled with sympathy from people who didn't. A mutual family friend texted me, "She's really going through it." I put my phone down and went back to work. The call from Martin came in March 2022. A Sunday evening. I was reading on my couch when his name appeared and I almost didn't answer. I answered. He sounded like a man who had aged 10 years in 3 months. His voice was worn at the edges in a way I hadn't heard before, not even at his lowest moments. "I need to talk to you," he said. He talked around it for several minutes. Mentioned Linda. Mentioned the house. Mentioned that things had been difficult. I let him talk. I didn't help him get to the point. "Victor," he finally said. Victor was Martin's cousin. Gregarious. Loud. The kind of man who always seemed to be having a better time than everyone else in the room. He had been at the same family gatherings as Linda for 15 years. Linda had been having an affair with Victor for approximately 4 years. Martin had found out 2 weeks before this call. He said, "I just don't understand how someone who loves you can." His voice broke. He stopped. Tried again. "How do you just do that to someone you?" I held the phone. And then I said the thing I had been sitting with for 3 years. I said it gently. Without cruelty. Without satisfaction, or at least without letting the satisfaction show. But I said it. "Martin," I said. "People make mistakes." Silence. "This doesn't have to be the end of everything," I continued. "Linda is not a bad person. She made a bad choice. That's not a reason to blow up your whole life." He didn't speak. "Money can be worked out," I said. "Try not to be petty about it. Consider the bigger picture. Forgiveness is the mature choice, isn't it? That's what mature people do. They don't blow up relationships over a mistake." The silence stretched. Longful. Complete. "Those are your words," I said. "From March 2019. Almost exactly. I wanted you to hear how they sound from this side of them." When he spoke, his voice had changed entirely. Stripped of the particular performance people don't even know they're giving until it's gone. "I know," he said. Then, "I know. I got that wrong," he said finally. Not as a tactic. Not as a bid for forgiveness. Just as a fact he had been carrying and could finally, simply set down. "I got a lot of things wrong with you." "Yes," I said. "The thing I keep thinking about," he said slowly, "is that I didn't do it to hurt you. I thought it would be fine. I thought you were strong enough not to need. Being strong, I said, is not the same as not needing things, Martin. I was not strong. I was trained. There is a difference. He went quiet again. Can we? He stopped. Is there still? I don't know yet, I said. Honestly. But I think we can talk. We stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes. He asked about Andy. He asked about my work. At one point he asked carefully, as if testing the weight of the question, "Are you happy?" I said yes. Genuinely. Without qualification. He said, "Good. I'm glad." And I believed him. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness, not the clean kind that wraps everything up. It was something smaller and more real. Two people damaged in different ways, sitting inside the same difficult truth together. That was enough. For now it was enough. Patricia Dumas resolved the trust matter by May 2022. Martin transferred the assets without litigation. Principal plus 6 years of accrued interest. $211,000. I held it in an account for a while. Checked it occasionally on my phone just to confirm it was real. My grandfather had seen me. Even when my own father hadn't. He had looked at me across 30 years of family dinners and Sunday afternoon visits and seen something worth protecting. It was real. Hannah and Ethan's marriage didn't survive the year. They separated in July 2022. Divorce finalized by November. Hannah moved back into Linda's house. Linda, managing her own difficult situation, was apparently not an easy housemate. There were arguments. Last I heard, Hannah had started over somewhere new. Different city, different circle, the way people do when the old story stops working. What I noticed when I was honest with myself was that none of it moved me the way I expected. I thought I would feel vindicated, satisfied. Some version of what the word karma is supposed to feel like. What I felt instead was quieter. Closer to distance. The noise from that chapter of my life had gotten faint enough that I didn't hear it anymore. I don't wish her harm. That is a genuine statement, not a performance. Whatever Hannah became, she was also shaped by the same house I was. The same parents. A family system that rewarded certain behaviors for 30 years and was then surprised when those behaviors continued. She made choices. So did the people who made those choices feel costless? She is not my concern anymore. Here is what I know now that I couldn't have articulated in March 2019, sitting on the edge of a bed in the dark, listening to the silence of a life I was going to have to rebuild entirely from scratch. Being underestimated is not the same as being worthless. I spent a childhood being told, not in words, but in the 100 small daily signals that carry more weight than words, that my needs were less urgent. My feelings less valid. My happiness less worth protecting. I absorbed that. I let it organize me. I became someone who asked for very little and thanked people graciously when they gave her less than that. That's not grace. That's not maturity. That's damage. And the difference between them matters. My grandfather knew. He looked at me across 30 years of birthday dinners and Sunday afternoons, and he saw something the rest of them missed. He built a wall around a piece of what was mine. He tried to make sure it reached me. The money wasn't the point. It helped significantly, but the point was that someone had seen me clearly enough to try to protect me. And that in the legal architecture of a trust established in 2005, there was proof. Andy asked me once, early in our relationship, what I wanted my life to look like in 10 years. I remember being embarrassed by how long it took me to answer. Not because I didn't know. Because I wasn't used to the question being asked in earnest. I wasn't accustomed to someone wanting the real answer rather than the appropriate one. I told him eventually. Specifically. In detail. He listened to all of it. That's the story really. The affair and the inheritance and the gala and the review, those are the plot. The story is this. I grew up being told I was the wrong kind of person to want things. And then, slowly with help, I stopped believing it. Martin and I speak occasionally. There is no clean resolution and I don't expect one. Trust is a structure, and structures neglected for decades don't rebuild in a season. He asks about Andy. He asks about my work. He asks if I'm happy. Some calls end warmly. Some end with a politeness that means we've reached the edge of safe ground. I take it for what it is. If this story means something to you, if you've spent time in a family where love was rationed, where someone else's needs always seem to outweigh yours, where you learned to make yourself small just to survive being in the room, I want you to hear this. The smallness was a strategy. It was never the truth. You were worth more than you were shown. I know that because I was too. My name is Claire. I'm 33 years old. I live in Charlotte with my husband and our dog, a 3-year-old basset hound named Emmett who takes up more of our bed than is reasonable and who is genuinely impossible to be sat around. I am a different person than I was in 2019. Not a perfect one. Not a fully healed one. But mine. For most of my life, I believed that being chosen meant being worthy. It took losing everything to understand the truth. I was worthy all along. The people who couldn't see it weren't capable of it. Not me. Them.